Canada just rewired its energy future, fast-tracking pipelines, easing tanker limits, and making Asian markets the priority customer.
This is not a minor tweak. It is Canada trading dependence for real sovereignty in energy exports and AI infrastructure.
Breaking tonight, the 150-year American monopoly on Canadian oil just ended. Mark Carney didn't ask permission, he declared independence. Power is shifting across North America tonight. Alberta demanded a pipeline to Asian markets, but instead of decades of regulatory delays, Ottawa guaranteed approval in 8 months. Instead of protecting America's exclusive access, the federal government opened the door to lifting the tanker ban entirely. Instead of environmental reviews blocking infrastructure, carbon capture technology accelerated construction timelines. Everyone believed Canada would remain locked into American energy markets forever. Washington had expected permanent discounted access to Canadian resources. Wall Street assumed Ottawa would never sacrifice environmental regulations for economic sovereignty. Analysts predicted coastal British Columbia would veto any pipeline expansion. They were all catastrophically wrong. Calgary, November 27, 2025. Standing beside Alberta Premier Danielle Smith at the signing ceremony, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a statement that electrified the energy sector. If Canadian energy independence is threatened, we will not hesitate. We will build the infrastructure to reach Asian markets starting immediately. Translation: Ottawa just told Washington that Canadian resources are no longer exclusively American property. And what happened next? The Prime Minister, who spent decades understanding global finance, reveals exactly why Canadian energy sovereignty is reshaping continental power dynamics while American market dominance collapses. Dear viewers, between late November and early 2026, something extraordinary is happening in North American energy relationships. Washington assumed permanent access. Ottawa said no, and Asia, patient and resource-hungry, became the customer every Canadian energy company started calling first. Let me show you exactly what this agreement actually does, because the details matter more than you realize. The Memorandum of Understanding commits Ottawa to enabling oil exports through a West Coast deepwater port, not studying it, not reviewing it, enabling it. The document explicitly states that if necessary, the federal government will adjust the coastal tanker ban to make Asian exports happen. Think about what that means for a moment. The tanker ban was implemented specifically to prevent oil shipment increases off British Columbia's coast. Environmental groups celebrated it as a permanent protection. Coastal First Nations supported it as safeguarding their waters. And now, Mark Carney just announced he'll change it if a pipeline project requires that change. But here's where it gets interesting. The pipeline itself would transport at least 1 million barrels daily. That's not a modest expansion. That's a fundamental restructuring of Canadian energy export capacity. And Carney made it clear this would prioritize Asian markets, not American refineries, not North American integration, Asia. The agreement exempts Alberta from a federal clean electricity regulations entirely. Those regulations would have forced natural gas power generation to meet strict emissions limits by 2035. Alberta's grid runs predominantly on natural gas. Under this deal, those federal rules don't apply to Alberta anymore. Let me translate what just happened. Ottawa told Alberta that federal environmental policy is negotiable when energy sovereignty is at stake. And Alberta, in exchange, committed to increasing its industrial carbon price to at least $130 per ton. Notice the careful language there. At least. Not exactly, not capped at least $130. The federal carbon backstop is scheduled to hit $170 per ton by 2030. During the technical briefing, government officials confirmed there's no guarantee Alberta's price will increase on pace with the federal rate. Danielle Smith told reporters afterward that the target of $170 by 2030 is too ambitious. Quote, "We've demonstrated, and I think the Prime Minister agrees, that's too high too fast. We understand there was always going to be a negotiation around that. We're just glad that we have the means to manage it our way in Alberta." End quote. Read between those lines. Alberta just secured the right to set its own carbon pricing timeline while accessing federal support for major energy infrastructure. That's not a compromise. That's Alberta winning the negotiation. But remember, nothing happens in isolation. This agreement pairs the pipeline project directly with the Pathways Alliance carbon capture initiative. Government officials stated explicitly that both projects must be built in tandem. You don't get the pipeline without the carbon capture. You don't get Asian market access without emissions reduction technology. The memorandum commits Ottawa and Alberta to working with Pathways Alliance partners, including Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips Canada, Imperial, and Suncor, to identify new emissions reduction projects by April 1st, with rollouts starting in 2027. Think about the strategic calculation here. Carney is positioning Canadian oil as the cleanest fossil fuel option in global markets. While American producers focus on volume, Canada is focusing on carbon-reduced production. When Asian countries face international pressure about climate commitments, which supplier looks more attractive? The one with carbon capture infrastructure already deployed. And here's the element most analysts are missing. The agreement sets a goal of boosting Alberta's electricity generation specifically to meet demands from AI data centers. Alberta has been struggling to attract major tech investment because the province can't guarantee sufficient power supply. Under this deal, Ottawa and Alberta commit to drafting a nuclear generation strategy by January 2027. You're watching Canada position itself as the destination for AI infrastructure investment while simultaneously securing energy export routes to the world's fastest growing markets. That's not crisis management, that's strategic positioning. Now, the opposition is predictable. Pierre Poilievre released a statement claiming this agreement doesn't promise a pipeline will be built, only that a proposal will be referred to a federal office for years of study. Quote, this is from a prime minister who promised during the election to move with unimaginable speed. The prime minister needs to do only one thing to get the pipeline built. Get out of the way, end quote. But look at what Poilievre isn't saying. He's not criticizing the pipeline concept. He's not opposing Asian market access. He's complaining about process speed. That's a politician who knows this deal is popular with his base, but needs to find something to attack. The NDP's response is more revealing. Member of Parliament Gord Johns called the agreement insulting and archaic, arguing it won't fly well in coastal British Columbia. Quote, this is not how you build trust and relationship with First Nations, with provinces, end quote. Translation, the NDP knows this threatens their British Columbia electoral support, but can't afford to directly oppose energy infrastructure that Alberta voters support. They're caught between their environmental base and their working-class energy sector supporters. Now, David Eby in British Columbia, he's pushing back hard. Lifting the tanker ban threatens projects his province already has running, not to mention the consensus he's built with coastal First Nations. That's real political capital he's risking. But here's what's interesting. Smith mentioned she was on the phone with Eby the night before the signing. They're not suddenly best friends. They don't see eye to eye on most of this, but they found something they could both work with. Trans Mountain expansion, yes. More LNG exports, also yes. Watch what's actually happening here. Eby is protecting his political position in BC, while acknowledging some pipeline infrastructure is acceptable. Smith is building the coalition she needs, project by project, rather than demanding comprehensive agreement up front. A group of First Nations in British Columbia stated that a new pipeline to the Pacific coast will never be built. Carney's response? The Memorandum of Understanding makes any pipeline approval contingent on the project, providing opportunities for Indigenous co-ownership and shared economic benefits. The agreement states there needs to be full partnership, including equity ownership and substantial economic benefits for First Nations in both Alberta and British Columbia. You're watching Carney neutralize the most powerful opposition argument before construction even begins. Instead of debating Indigenous rights, he's offering Indigenous ownership. Instead of arguing about consultation, he's building profit sharing into the project structure from day one. And here's the detail that reveals everything about Carney's strategy. No private sector company has stepped forward yet with an offer to build this pipeline. Smith admitted that openly, but she added, quote, I'm pretty confident with the people we have at the table, that one, or a consortium of them, once we establish that it's on the major projects list, will be willing to take this on, end quote. Think about what that means. This agreement isn't responding to private sector demand. This agreement is creating the regulatory conditions that make private sector investment viable. Carney isn't waiting for companies to propose projects and then approving them. He's designing the policy framework first, then inviting investment. That's the opposite of how Canadian energy policy has worked for decades. Usually companies propose projects, then spend years fighting through regulatory reviews. Now, Ottawa is pre-approving the framework, streamlining the major projects process, and telling companies, if you build this, we guarantee approval. The memorandum requires a pipeline application to be submitted to the Major Projects Office by July 1st. Smith had previously committed to spring timing. That's an 8-month window from signing to application. For energy infrastructure of this scale, that's not just fast, that's unprecedented. And the agreement explicitly states one or more pipelines would be built in addition to the Trans Mountain expansion, not instead of. In addition to. Canada isn't replacing American market access with Asian market access. Canada is adding Asian market access while maintaining American relationships. You're watching a prime minister who understands that true sovereignty isn't choosing between customers. It's having multiple customers compete for your product. Smith told reporters she hopes this deal will take the air out of Alberta's separatist movement. Quote, "When Ottawa works with Alberta, trust follows." End quote. That's not just political rhetoric. That's acknowledgement that Western alienation grows when Ottawa imposes policy on Alberta rather than negotiating with Alberta. Carney didn't impose this agreement. He negotiated it. He gave Alberta regulatory exemptions, carbon pricing flexibility, and infrastructure commitments. In exchange, he got Alberta's commitment to emissions reduction, Indigenous partnership, and federal oversight of major projects. This isn't Ottawa controlling Alberta. This isn't Alberta defying Ottawa. This is federalism actually working the way it's supposed to work. The memorandum commits both governments to signing an agreement by April 1st, mandating a 75% cut in methane emissions by 2035 compared to 2023 and a maiden June levels. That's a slight change from Ottawa's previous draft regulations, which called for 75% reduction by 2030 compared to 2012 levels. 5 extra years. Different baseline. Same ultimate reduction target. Alberta gets more time. Ottawa gets the emissions cut it wanted. Both sides can claim victory, and while everyone's focused on the pipeline and carbon pricing, there's a clause in this agreement that might matter most long-term. The commitment to nuclear generation strategy by January 2027. Canada currently generates about 15% of its electricity from nuclear power. If Alberta develops nuclear capacity at scale, that transforms not just Alberta's grid, but Western Canada's entire energy infrastructure. You could run AI data centers on nuclear power. You could electrify oil sands operations. You could export clean electricity to neighboring provinces and states. Nuclear isn't just about meeting current demand, it's about creating the foundation for the next generation of energy-intensive industry. Look, everything I've shown you tonight comes from public documents and official reporting. But the conclusions, those are mine. You decide what they mean. What I see is a prime minister who understands that Canadian sovereignty isn't about dramatic speeches, it's about infrastructure. It's about creating alternatives to American markets before those alternatives become desperate necessities. It's about positioning Canada as the energy supplier that combines volume, reliability, and emissions reduction in a way no other producer can match. The Americans assumed permanent access to Canadian resources. The environmental movement assumed federal regulations were permanent policy. The separatists assumed Ottawa would never work constructively with Alberta. And all of them are discovering the same truth tonight. Mark Carney doesn't play the game everyone expects. He changes the game itself. If you're following the transformation of Canadian energy policy in real time, if you're watching sovereignty become strategy rather than just rhetoric, you're in the right place. Because what happened in Calgary on November 27th isn't an isolated agreement. It's the beginning of Canada's energy independence era. And the implications are just starting to unfold. This is Canada Next, where we don't just report what Carney does, we decode why it matters before Washington figures it out. Subscribe if you want to understand Canadian power moves 24 hours before the American media catches up, because the next shift is already happening, and you'll want to see it coming.